Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm thankful. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Picture this. It's 1864 in the Bohemian quarter of Montmartre, Paris. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, passionate debates about art, and the unmistakable aroma of wormwood. In dimly lit cafes across the city, artists are gathering for their daily ritual, a ceremony so sacred that it defined an entire era. They call it the Green Hour, and what they're about to consume will either unlock their creative genius or drive them to complete madness. The drink sitting before them isn't just alcohol, it's absinthe, a spirit so potent, so controversial, that entire nations would eventually ban it. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. This wasn't just any ordinary beverage. This was a liquid muse that would inspire masterpieces while simultaneously destroying the minds of those who dared to embrace it. What I'm about to reveal in this series will shock you. We're going to explore how absinthe became the creative fuel for legendary artists like Vincent van Gogh, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Oscar Wilde. But more importantly, we'll uncover the dark truth about how this emerald elixir ultimately consumed the very souls it once inspired. At the end of this journey, you'll understand why absinthe was called both the muse of artists and the destroyer of men. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how powerful this story really is. Edgar Degas, the master of ballet paintings, credited absinthe with helping him see movement in ways he never had before. Pablo Picasso's Blue Period coincided perfectly with his heaviest absinthe consumption. Ernest Hemingway wrote entire novels while under its influence. These weren't coincidences. These were the direct results of a chemical compound that literally altered human consciousness. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like just another story about artists and alcohol. But what makes absinthe different from every other drink in history is its unique psychoactive properties. Unlike wine or whiskey, absinthe contains thujon, a compound found in wormwood that affects the brain in ways scientists are still trying to understand today. This single ingredient turned a simple aperitif into something that could unlock creativity while simultaneously unlocking madness. The ritual itself was almost religious in nature. Artists would place a sugar cube on a slotted spoon, balanced over their glass of absinthe. Then, slowly, methodically, they would drip ice-cold water over the sugar, watching as the clear green liquid transformed into an opalescent, cloudy mixture. This transformation, this magical moment when the drink changed before their very eyes, symbolized something much deeper. It represented the transformation of consciousness, the moment when reality began to bend and artistic vision became crystal clear. But here's where our story takes a darker turn. The same drink that inspired breathtaking masterpieces also led to violent hallucinations, complete mental breakdowns, and in some cases, murder. The line between creative genius and destructive madness became so thin that it was almost invisible. Artists who embraced the green fairy found themselves walking a tightrope between brilliance and insanity. Never knowing which side they would fall on, let me introduce you to our first character. A man whose relationship with absinthe would define not just his art, but his entire tragic existence. His name was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and his story perfectly encapsulates everything beautiful and terrifying about the absinthe era. Born into French aristocracy in 1864, Henri seemed destined for a life of privilege and comfort. But fate had other plans. When Henri was just 13 years old, he broke his left leg. A year later, he broke his right leg. These weren't ordinary childhood accidents. Due to a rare genetic condition, his bones never healed properly, leaving him with a fully developed torso but legs that remained childlike. By adulthood, Henri stood just 4 feet 8 inches tall, a fact that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rejected by high society because of his appearance, Henri found refuge in the underground world of Montmartre. Here, among the dancers, prostitutes, and outcasts of Parisian society, he discovered his true calling as an artist. But more importantly, he discovered absinthe, the drink that would become both his greatest inspiration and his ultimate destroyer. Henri's first encounter with absinthe happened at the famous Moulin Rouge in 1889. He had been commissioned to create promotional posters for the cabaret, and it was there, surrounded by can-can dancers and late-night revelry, that he first tasted the Green Fairy. The effect was immediate and profound. The alcohol numbed his physical pain, while the Thujones seemed to sharpen his artistic vision to an almost supernatural degree. Within months, Henri's art underwent a complete transformation. His paintings became bolder, more expressive, capturing movement and emotion in ways that had never been seen before. His famous poster of La Goulue, the star dancer at the Moulin Rouge, wasn't just a piece of advertising. It was a revolutionary work of art that captured the very essence of Parisian nightlife. And it was created entirely under the influence of absinthe. But Henri didn't just drink absinthe. He carried it with him everywhere in a specially designed hollow walking cane. This wasn't just eccentricity. This was necessity. The physical pain from his deformed legs was constant and excruciating, and absinthe was the only thing that provided relief. By 1895, Henri was consuming nearly a litre of absinthe every single day. Were extraordinary, the results. During his heaviest absinthe period, Henri created some of the most iconic images in art history. His paintings of the Moulin Rouge, his intimate portraits of Parisian nightlife, his revolutionary use of colour and movement. This all have flowed directly from his absinthe-enhanced perception. He could see things that others missed, capture emotions that others couldn't express, create art that seemed to pulse with life itself. But the Green Fairy demanded a price for her gifts. As Henri's artistic genius reached its peak, his physical and mental health began a rapid decline. The daily consumption of absinthe was slowly poisoning his body while simultaneously feeding his creativity. He began experiencing violent mood swings, hallucinations, and periods of complete mental absence. Friends reported seeing him paint for hours while carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. The most disturbing aspect of Henri's relationship with absinthe was how it amplified both his talents and his demons. When he was creating, the drink made him feel invincible, capable of capturing the very soul of his subjects on canvas. But when he wasn't painting, the absinthe revealed the deep pain and isolation that had haunted him since childhood. He would spend entire nights wandering the streets of Montmartre, talking to the Green Fairy as if she were a real person, begging her to take away his loneliness. By 1899, Henri's absinthe consumption had reached truly dangerous levels. He was drinking from the moment he woke up until he collapsed at night, often painting in states of such intoxication that he couldn't remember creating entire masterpieces. His friends and family staged multiple interventions, but Henri refused to give up the drink that had become both his muse and his master. The tragic irony of Henri's story is that absinthe gave him everything he wanted, while simultaneously destroying everything he was. The drink that allowed him to create timeless art also prevented him from forming lasting relationships. The substance that freed him from physical pain also trapped him in psychological torment. The Green Fairy that inspired his greatest works also authored his inevitable destruction. As we delve deeper into Henri's story in the next part of our series, you'll discover the shocking truth about what absinthe actually does to the human brain, and why so many brilliant artists couldn't resist its deadly embrace. You'll learn about the secret ingredient that made absinthe different from every other alcoholic beverage, and how this single compound changed the course of art history forever. But Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec was just the beginning. His story represents only one thread in a much larger tapestry of genius and madness that defined the absinthe era. Coming up, we'll meet Vincent van Gogh, whose relationship with the Green Fairy would lead to some of the most beautiful paintings ever created, and one of the most tragic endings in art history. We'll explore Oscar Wilde's passionate love affair with absinthe, and how it inspired his greatest literary works, while ultimately leading to his downfall and exile. The Green Fairy touched the lives of dozens of legendary artists, writers, and musicians, and in every case, the pattern was the same. First came the inspiration, the burst of creative energy that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. Then came the masterpieces, works of art so revolutionary that they changed entire movements. But finally, inevitably, came the destruction. The price that the Green Fairy demanded for her gifts was always the same: everything. We'll explore how an entire generation of creative minds fell under the spell of a drink that promised everything and delivered a terrible price. But to truly understand the journey power of absinthe, we need to back to its origins, to the moment when this emerald elixir first emerged from the shadows of Swiss pharmacies to become the most controversial beverage in European history. The year was 1792, and Dr. Pierre Ordinaire, a French physician living in exile in Switzerland, was experimenting with medicinal herbs in his makeshift laboratory. What that day he create would change the world forever. By combining grand wormwood, anise, fennel, and a carefully guarded selection of other botanicals, Dr. Ordinaire had unknowingly birthed the Green Fairy herself. Initially marketed as a cure-all medicine, absinthe promised everything from stomach to heel ailments to depression. Little did anyone know that this innocent-looking green liquid would soon become the most addictive substance of the 19th century. The transformation from medicine to obsession happened gradually, then suddenly. By the 1840s, French soldiers stationed in Algeria were drinking absinthe-tod dysentery. When Prevent Malaria and these soldiers returned home, they brought with them not just stories of war, but an insatiable craving for the Green Fairy. What had been a military ration quickly became the drink of choice in Parisian cafes, and from there it spread like wildfire across Europe. But here's what made absinthe truly different from every other alcoholic beverage of its time. The drink contained thujone, a chemical compound derived from wormwood that had never been consumed in such concentrated doses before. Modern scientists describe thujone as a GABA antagonist, meaning it blocks the brain's natural calming mechanisms while simultaneously stimulating areas associated with creativity and perception. In simpler terms, absinthe didn't just intoxicate the body like wine or beer. It fundamentally altered how the brain processed reality itself. The effects were unlike anything people had experienced before. Users reported seeing colours more vividly, hearing music more clearly, and experiencing emotions with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. Time seemed to slow down, allowing artists to observe details they'd never noticed before. Shadows danced differently under absinthe's influence. Light took on qualities that seemed almost alive. For creative minds already pushing the boundaries of their art, absinthe offered a gateway into entirely new realms of perception. The ritual of drinking absinthe became as important as the drink itself. This wasn't something you gulped down quickly like whiskey or sipped casually like wine. The preparation required patience, precision, and an almost ceremonial reverence. Artists would gather in cafes every evening for what they called l'heure verte, the green hour, a secret time when the mundane world transformed into something magical. The process began with pouring absinthe into a specially designed glass, usually filling it about 1/3 full. The liquid at this stage was clear and emerald green, deceptively innocent looking. Then came the sugar cube, placed carefully on a perforated spoon that balanced perfectly across the rim of the glass. The final step was the most crucial, slowly dripping ice-cold water over the sugar cube, one drop at a time. As the water mixed with the absinthe, something extraordinary happened. The clear green liquid began to cloud, transforming into an opalescent, almost pearlescent mixture that seemed to glow from within. This transformation was called the lausch, and it represented far more than a simple chemical reaction. For the artists watching this metamorphosis, it symbolized their own transformation from ordinary human beings into vessels of creative inspiration. The lausch effect occurred because of the essential oils in the absinthe, particularly those from anise and fennel, which are soluble in alcohol but not in water. As the water diluted the alcohol content, these oils came out of solution, creating microscopic droplets that scattered light and gave the drink its mystical appearance. But for the artists of the 19th century, scientific explanations mattered less than the magical reality unfolding before their eyes. Edgar Degas, the master of capturing movement in his ballet paintings, described his first absinthe experience as revolutionary. Sitting in the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes in 1876, Edgar watched the green liquid transform before his eyes and felt something shift in his perception. When he looked up at the dancers rehearsing in the cafe's mirror, he could suddenly see the mathematics of their movement, the precise angles of their bodies, the fleeting expressions that revealed their inner thoughts. That night, Edgar went home and painted what would become one of his most famous works, L'Absinthe. The painting shows a woman and man sitting at a cafe table, both lost in their own worlds, the woman staring vacantly ahead with a glass of the pale green drink before her. The painting captures something essential about the absinthe experience, the way it could simultaneously connect you to profound artistic insights while completely isolating you from human connection. The speed at which absinthe spread through artistic communities was breathtaking. By the 1860s, virtually every major artist, writer, and musician in Paris had tried the green fairy. But more than just trying it, they were incorporating it into their daily routines, their creative processes, and ultimately, their very identities as artists. Paul Verlaine, the influential French poet, wrote his most celebrated verses while under absinthe's influence. His poem, The Green Fairy, described the drink as both lover and destroyer, a muse who whispered secrets of the universe while slowly draining away his sanity. Verlaine's relationship with absinthe perfectly embodied the paradox that would define an entire generation. The substance that unleashed their greatest creative potential also contained the seeds of their destruction. Arthur Rimbaud, Verlaine's protégé and lover, took his absinthe consumption even further. The young poet believed that systematic derangement of the senses was essential for true artistic vision. Absinthe became his primary tool for achieving this derangement, and the results were spectacular. At just 19 years old, while heavily under the influence of the Green Fairy, Rimbaud wrote A Season in Hell, a work so revolutionary that it changed poetry forever. But Rimbaud's absinthe-fueled genius came at an enormous cost. By his early 20s, the constant consumption of the drink had left him physically and emotionally shattered. He abandoned poetry entirely, fleeing to Africa, where he lived as a trader, until his death at 37. His final letters home spoke of hallucinations that never stopped, of seeing green fairies dancing in the desert sun, of hearing voices that called him back to the cafes of Paris. The tragedy of Rimbaud's story reveals something crucial about absinthe's power. The drink didn't just enhance existing creativity, it seemed to demand total surrender to its influence. Artists who tried to maintain control, who attempted to use absinthe as merely a tool rather than a master, often found themselves unable to access its full potential. But those who gave themselves completely to the Green Fairy's embrace discovered creative powers they never knew they possessed, even as they sacrificed their health, their relationships, and ultimately their lives. As absinthe's popularity exploded across Europe, its effects on artistic output became undeniable. The period from 1860 to 1910, which coincided exactly with absinthe's golden age, produced some of the most revolutionary art in human history. Impressionism, post-impressionism, symbolism, Art Nouveau. These movements all emerged during the height of absinthe consumption, and their characteristics perfectly mirror the drink's effects on human perception. The Impressionists' focus on capturing fleeting moments of light and colour reflected absinthe's ability to heighten visual perception. The Post-Impressionists' bold use of colour and emotion mirrored the drink's capacity to intensify feelings. The Symbolists' interest in dreams and mystical experiences align with absinthe's psyche perfectly-oactive properties. It was as if an entire era of artistic innovation had been filtered through the lens of the Green Fairy's influence. Claude Monet, though more moderate in his absinthe consumption than many of his contemporaries, credited the drink with helping him see light in new ways. His famous series of cathedral paintings, capturing the same subject at different times of day, were created during a period when he regularly consumed absinthe during his afternoon painting sessions. The subtle variations in light and colour that make these paintings so extraordinary may have been impossible to perceive without the heightened visual acuity that absinthe provided. Paul Cézanne took a different approach, using absinthe as a reward system for his work. He would paint for hours in a state of complete sobriety, pushing himself to capture the essential structure of his subjects. But when he finished a particularly challenging piece, he would celebrate with a carefully prepared glass of absinthe, allowing the drink to wash over him as he contemplated what he had created. Cézanne believed this ritual helped him understand his own artistic process, revealing truths about his work that only became visible under the Green Fairy's influence. The financial aspect of absinthe's rise cannot be ignored. As demand exploded, production shifted from small Swiss distilleries to massive French factories. The Pernod Company, founded in 1805, became synonymous with quality absinthe, producing millions of bottles annually buys. But as the 1870 production increased, so did the temptation to cut corners, to substitute cheaper ingredients, to increase alcohol content without regard for safety. This industrialization of absinthe production marked the beginning of the end for the Green Fairy's golden age. What had once been a carefully crafted elixir, balanced and refined, began to vary wildly in quality and potency. Some bottles contained dangerous levels of thujon, while others included toxic additives like antimony and copper sulfate to enhance the green colour. Artists who had grown dependent on absinthe's effects found themselves consuming increasingly unpredictable and dangerous substances. The medical community began to take notice as emergency rooms across Europe reported a new type of patient: absinthe addicts suffering from hallucinations, seizures, and violent behaviour. Doctors coined the term absinthism to describe a condition that seemed distinct from ordinary alcoholism. Patients exhibited symptoms that went far beyond typical alcohol poisoning: vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Dr. Valentin Magnan stood in his laboratory at Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, staring at the brain tissue samples before him. The year was 1884, and what he was about to discover would send shockwaves through the medical community and ultimately seal absinthe's fate. These weren't ordinary autopsy specimens. These were the brains of artists, writers, and musicians who had died from what was being called absinthism, and what Dr. Magnan found defied everything physicians thought they knew about alcohol's effects on the human mind. The brain tissue showed patterns of damage unlike anything associated with wine or whiskey consumption. The neurons appeared to have been systematically attacked, with particular devastation in areas responsible for impulse control, reality testing, and emotional regulation. But most disturbing of all was the discovery of microscopic green crystalline deposits scattered throughout the tissue. These crystals, Dr. Magnan would later determine, were concentrated thujone that had accumulated over years of absinthe consumption. What made these findings even more alarming was the speed at which the damage occurred. While traditional alcoholism might take decades to produce visible brain changes, absinthe seemed to accomplish the same destruction in just a few years. Dr. Magnan's research suggested that thujone didn't just intoxicate the brain, it fundamentally rewired it, creating new neural pathways that craved increasingly intense experiences while simultaneously destroying the mechanisms that might have provided natural satisfaction or contentment. Meanwhile, in the Bohemian quarter of Montmartre, these medical discoveries felt like distant thunder to the artists who continued their nightly rituals with the Green Fairy. The warnings from doctors and temperance advocates only seemed to enhance absinthe's allure. After all, wasn't danger an essential component of great art? Wasn't the risk of madness a small price to pay for transcendent creative vision? Vincent van Gogh embodied this philosophy more completely than perhaps any other artist of his generation. When Vincent first encountered absinthe in 1886 during his time in Paris, he was already struggling with mental instability and financial desperation. His brother Theo's letters from this period describe Vincent as tormented by something he cannot name, searching desperately for a way to unlock the artistic vision he felt burning inside him, but could never quite reach. Vincent's first taste of absinthe occurred at the Café du Tambourin, where he had been having an affair with the Italian proprietress, Agostina Segatori. The relationship was tumultuous and passionate, fueled by artistic debates that lasted until dawn and culminating in nights of shared absinthe consumption. Agostina introduced Vincent to the proper ritual, teaching him to appreciate not just the drink's effects, but the meditative quality of its preparation. The transformation in Vincent's work was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks of beginning regular absinthe consumption, his paintings took on qualities that seemed to pulse with supernatural energy. Colours became more vivid, brushstrokes more dynamic, compositions more emotionally charged. His famous painting, The Potato Eaters, was created during one of his early absinthe periods, and the work captures something essential about the drink's influence: the ability to see profound humanity in the most ordinary subjects. But Vincent's relationship with absinthe was complicated by his existing mental fragility. Where other artists found that the drink enhanced their natural creativity, Vincent discovered that absinthe amplified everything, including his deepest fears and most violent impulses. His letters to Theo during this period describe experiences that sound more like psychotic episodes than artistic inspiration. Seeing halos of light around ordinary objects, hearing voices that commanded him to paint specific subjects, feeling as though his skin was crawling with invisible insects. The most disturbing aspect of Vincent's absinthe consumption was how it interacted with his existing mental illness. Modern psychiatrists believe Vincent suffered from bipolar disorder, possibly complicated by temporal lobe epilepsy. Absinthe's thujone content would have acted like gasoline thrown on an already burning fire, intensifying his manic episodes while making his depressive periods even darker and more dangerous. Despite these risks, or perhaps because of them, Vincent couldn't stop drinking absinthe. The periods when he abstained from the Green Fairy were marked by creative stagnation and overwhelming despair. Only when he was under absinthe's influence could he access the visionary state that allowed him to create his masterpieces. This created a vicious cycle. The drink was slowly destroying his mind, but without it, he felt unable to justify his existence as an artist. Vincent's move to Arles in 1888 marked the beginning of his most productive and most destructive period. Away from the social constraints of Paris, he began consuming absinthe in quantities that shocked even his bohemian friends. His daily routine involved painting from dawn until the early afternoon, then beginning his absinthe ritual as the sun set. By evening, He would be in a state of such altered consciousness that neighbors reported seeing him painting by candlelight in his garden, creating works that seemed to glow with their own internal fire. The paintings from this period, including The Starry Night over the Rhone and Café Terrace at Night, reveal the full extent of Absinthe's influence on Vincent's perception. The swirling dynamic brushstrokes that have become his signature weren't just artistic choices, they were visual representations of how Absinthe altered his vision. The intense yellows and blues that dominate these works mirror the colour hallucinations commonly reported by heavy absinthe users. But the Green Fairy's gifts came with an increasingly steep price. Vincent's letters from Arles describe experiences that sound like sustained psychotic episodes, conversations with stars, arguments with his paintings, nights when he believed his brushes were speaking to him in languages he couldn't understand, but somehow comprehended. His famous self-portraits from this period show eyes that seem to burn with an otherworldly fire, but also reveal the toll that constant absinthe consumption was taking on his physical health. The incident with his ear, which occurred on December 23, 1888, was directly precipitated by an absinthe binge that had lasted several days. Vincent had been painting almost continuously, sustained only by the Green Fairy and occasional pieces of bread. When Paul Gauguin arrived for a visit and criticised Vincent's latest work, something snapped. In a fit of rage, fueled by absinthe and mental illness, Vincent attacked his friend with a razor blade, then turned the weapon on himself when Gauguin fled. The self-mutilation wasn't random violence, it was the logical conclusion of months of escalating absinthe-induced psychosis. Vincent later wrote that he had been hearing voices telling him to cut away the lies, and in his altered state, he believed his ear was somehow preventing him from hearing the true voices of his artistic inspiration. The act was both deeply symbolic and utterly irrational, the perfect embodiment of Absinthe's dual nature as muse and destroyer. Following the ear incident, Vincent was hospitalized and forced to abstain from absinthe for several weeks. The withdrawal was brutal, involving hallucinations, seizures, and periods of complete catatonia. But perhaps more disturbing was what happened to his artistic vision during this period of sobriety. The paintings he created without absinthe's influence, while technically competent, lacked the supernatural energy that had characterized his recent work. They seemed flat, ordinary, almost lifeless by comparison. This realization terrified Vincent more than any physical symptom of withdrawal. If absinthe was slowly killing him, but sobriety meant artistic death, what choice did he really have? The letters he wrote during his recovery reveal a man caught between two equally unacceptable fates: madness or mediocrity. For an artist who had sacrificed everything in pursuit of transcendent vision, mediocrity felt like a fate worse than death. When Vincent was released from the hospital, he immediately returned to absinthe, but with a new understanding of its power over him. His consumption became more ritualistic, almost religious in its intensity. He would prepare his evening glass with the care of a priest performing communion, understanding that he was literally consuming both his salvation and his damnation with each sip. The final period of Vincent's life, from his release from the hospital until his death in July 1890, represents the most concentrated burst of genius in art history. Fueled by absinthe and driven by the knowledge that his time was running out, Vincent created some of his most famous works: The Starry Night, Wheatfield with Cypresses, Portrait of Dr. Gachet. These paintings seem to vibrate with an energy that transcends ordinary artistic expression, as if Vincent had managed to capture something essential about the nature of consciousness itself. But the cost of this artistic explosion was Vincent's complete psychological disintegration. His final letters describe a man who had lost all ability to distinguish between his absinthe-induced visions and reality. He wrote of conversations with the stars, of paintings that moved and spoke, of colours that had their own consciousness and desires. The green fairy had given him everything he had ever wanted as an artist. But in return, she had claimed his sanity, his health, and ultimately his life. Vincent's suicide on July 29, 1890, was the inevitable conclusion of his relationship with Absinthe. The shot he fired into his chest wasn't just an act of desperation. It was the final surrender to a battle he had been fighting since his first taste of the green fairy. In his final moments, witnesses reported that he spoke of being free from the voices, free from the visions, free from the terrible burden of seeing too much, feeling too intensely, creating gently. The tragedy too erg of Vincent's story extends beyond his individual fate to represent something larger about the entire Absinthe era. Here was an artist whose natural talent was extraordinary, whose vision was revolutionary, whose dedication to his craft was absolute. But Absinthe transformed that dedication into obsession, that vision into hallucination, that talent into a force that consumed everything in its path. Yet Absinthe, would Vincent van Gogh have created the works that continue to move people more than a century after his death? Would the starry night exist without the altered consciousness that allowed him to see movement in stillness, energy in emptiness, life in the infinite? These questions haunted the artistic community as news of Vincent's death spread through the cafes of Paris, and they continue to haunt us today. The medical establishment, however, had no such ambiguity about Absinthe's role in Vincent's demise. Dr. Magnan's research had provided scientific evidence for what many had long suspected. Absinthe wasn't just another alcoholic beverage. It was a psychoactive drug that could trigger permanent changes in brain chemistry. Vincent's case became a cautionary tale cited by physicians across Europe, proof that the green fairy's gifts were too dangerous for civilized society to tolerate. But the artists themselves remained largely unconvinced by medical warnings. If anything, Vincent's tragic end only enhanced Absinthe's mystique among creative communities. Here was proof that the drink could unlock levels of artistic achievement that were impossible through ordinary means. The fact that it might also lead to madness and death seemed, to many artists, like a reasonable trade-off for the chance at immortal greatness. This attitude was perfectly embodied by Oscar Wilde, who had followed Vincent's career with great interest and drew his own conclusions about the relationship between absinthe, creativity, and self-destruction. Oscar's approach to the green fairy would be fundamentally different from Vincent's tortured relationship with the drink, but no less consequential for his art and his life. Oscar Wilde stepped into the Café de la Paix on a crisp October evening in 1891, his emerald green coat perfectly complementing the absinthe glass that would soon sit before him. Unlike the tortured artists who had come before him, Oscar approached the green fairy not as a desperate seeker of inspiration, but as a connoisseur of beauty and experience. His relationship with absinthe would become one of the most sophisticated and ultimately tragic love affairs history. Oscar in Literary had first encountered absinthe during his student days at Oxford, but it wasn't until his rise to fame as his most celebrated wit London that he truly embraced the drink's possibilities. For Oscar, absinthe represented the perfect marriage of aesthetic beauty and sensual experience. The ritual of preparation appealed to his love of ceremony, while the drink's effects enhanced his already formidable powers of conversation and observation. What made Oscar's absinthe consumption different from his contemporaries was his intellectual approach to the experience. Where Vincent van Gogh had surrendered completely to the drink's chaotic influence, Oscar sought to harness and direct its power. He developed what he called his green philosophy, a systematic exploration of how absinthe could be used to enhance specific aspects of artistic creation without completely overwhelming rational thought. Oscar's evening routine at the Café de la Paix became legendary among Parisian literary circles. He would arrive precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed impeccably and carrying a leather-bound notebook filled with observations from his day. The waiter would bring his usual glass of absinthe without being asked, along with the ornate silver spoon that Oscar had commissioned specifically for his ritual. The preparation would take exactly 15 minutes, during which Oscar would hold court with whoever happened to be nearby, his wit sharpening with each drop of water that fell onto the sugar cube. But it was after the preparation was complete, after the first sip of the transformed emerald liquid, that Oscar's true genius emerged. His conversations would take on an otherworldly quality, as if the absinthe had unlocked some hidden chamber of his mind where perfect phrases lived in waiting. Fellow writers who witnessed these performances described them as supernatural, as if Oscar had become a conduit for some divine source of wit and wisdom. The influence of these absinthe-enhanced evenings can be seen throughout Oscar's greatest works. The Picture of Dorian Gray, written during the height of his Green Fairy period, contains passages that seem to pulse with the same otherworldly energy that characterized his cafe conversations. The novel's exploration of beauty, corruption, and the price of transcendence mirrors perfectly the themes that dominated Oscar's own relationship with absinthe. But Oscar's masterpiece, The Importance of Being Earnest, represents the pinnacle of his absinthe-influenced creativity. The play's brilliant wordplay, its perfect comic timing, its ability to find profound truth in apparent nonsense, all of these qualities emerged from the heightened state of consciousness that absinthe provided. Oscar would later write that the entire plot came to him during a single absinthe session, arriving fully formed like a gift from the Green Fairy herself. The dialogue in The Importance of Being Earnest reveals the specific ways that absinthe enhanced Oscar's natural talents. The characters speak with a precision and wit that seems almost inhuman, as if each word had been weighed and measured for maximum impact. This wasn't just clever writing, it was the product of a mind operating under the influence of a substance that could slow down time and reveal the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. Algernon's famous line about the relationship between style and sincerity. In matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing, could only have been written by someone whose perception had been altered by absinthe. The observation is too perfectly constructed, too precisely balanced between profundity and absurdity to have emerged from ordinary consciousness. It bears the unmistakable signature of the Green Fairy's influence. But Oscar's relationship with absinthe was complicated by his sexuality and his position in Victorian society. Unlike the bohemian artists of Montmartre, who could indulge their vices openly, Oscar had to maintain at least the appearance of respectability. His absinthe consumption became part of his secret life, connected to the same hidden world that included his relationships with young men and his exploration of forbidden pleasures. This connection between absinthe and sexual transgression would prove to be Oscar's undoing. The drink didn't just enhance his creativity, it also lowered his inhibitions and made him careless about maintaining the careful balance between his public and private personas. Under absinthe's influence, Oscar became bolder in his relationships, more open about his true nature, more willing to take risks that his sober mind would have recognized as dangerous. The affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, which would ultimately destroy Oscar's career and reputation, began during an absinthe-fueled evening at the Savoy Hotel in 1891. Oscar had been drinking steadily throughout the day, preparing for the opening night of one of his plays, when Alfred arrived unexpected and uninvited. The attraction between them was immediate and overwhelming, intensified by the Green Fairy's influence until it became impossible to resist. What followed was a passionate and destructive relationship that consumed Oscar's attention and resources for the next 4 years. Alfred was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly reckless, embodying all of the dangerous allure that absinthe represented. Like the Green Fairy herself, Alfred promised transcendence while delivering destruction, offering love while demanding sacrifice. The parallels between Oscar's relationship with absinthe and his relationship with Alfred are striking. and probably not coincidental. Both represented forbidden pleasures that society condemned, but that Oscar found essential to his identity as an artist. Both enhanced his creativity while simultaneously threatening his reputation and safety. Both demanded increasingly risky behavior as tolerance built and the initial thrill diminished. Oscar's letters to Alfred during this period reveal a man intoxicated by more than just absinthe. His language takes on the same heightened, almost hallucinogenic quality that characterized his Green Fairy experiences. He writes of love as if it were a drug, describing withdrawal symptoms when separated from Alfred, that mirror exactly the physical and emotional effects of absinthe withdrawal. The tragedy of Oscar's story is that he recognized the parallels between these two addictions but felt powerless to resist either one. In his private diary, entries that wouldn't be discovered until decades after his death, he wrote extensively about the way absinthe and forbidden love seemed to reinforce each other, creating a cycle of craving and satisfaction that grew stronger with each repetition. By 1894, Oscar's consumption of both absinthe and risk had reached levels that alarmed even his closest friends. He was drinking the Green Fairy at breakfast, carrying flasks of it to social events, and consuming quantities that would have killed less experienced users. Simultaneously, his relationship with Alfred had become so public and scandalous that prosecution seemed inevitable. The trial that would destroy Oscar's life began not with his arrest, but with a series of absinthe-influenced decisions that demonstrated just how completely the Green Fairy had compromised his judgment. When Alfred's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, publicly accused Oscar of being a sodomite, a sober of mind would have recognized the wisdom ignoring the insult. But Oscar, emboldened by years of absinthe-enhanced confidence, chose to sue for libel instead. The decision to pursue legal action against Queensberry was made during what Oscar's friends later described as a 3-day absinthe binge. Witnesses reported that Oscar seemed to believe he was invincible, protected by his fame and talent from any possible consequences. The Green Fairy had convinced him that he could triumph over society's prejudices through the sheer force of his personality and wit. The trial itself became a public spectacle that destroyed not only Oscar, but also the entire aesthetic movement he represented. Under cross-examination, Oscar's absinthe-impaired reflexes and judgment failed him repeatedly. The quick wit that had made him famous became a liability as he made admissions and observations that sealed his fate. The prosecution, recognizing that they were facing a man whose faculties were compromised by years of substance abuse, pressed their advantage mercilessly. When the guilty verdict was announced, Oscar's immediate reaction revealed just how completely absinthe had altered his perception of reality. Instead of the shock and despair that would have been natural, he seemed almost relieved, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment of ultimate destruction. Friends who visited him in prison reported that he spoke of his conviction as if it were the natural conclusion of his relationship with the Green Fairy, the final price that had to be paid for years of transcendent experience. The 2 years Oscar spent in Reading jail were marked by forced sobriety that proved almost unbearable. Without absinthe to mediate his experience of reality, Oscar found himself confronting the full horror of his situation without any chemical buffer. The withdrawal symptoms were severe, involving hallucinations, seizures, and periods of catatonic depression that lasted for weeks. But it was during this period of enforced abstinence that Oscar created what many consider his greatest work, De Profundis, the long letter to Alfred Douglas that serves as both love letter and condemnation, confession and philosophy. Written without the influence of absinthe, the work has a clarity and emotional honesty that his earlier writings, brilliant as they were, sometimes lacked. Reading De Profundis today, one can trace the evolution of Oscar's understanding of his relationship with both absinthe and destructive love. He writes of addiction not just as physical dependence, but as a spiritual condition that transforms the addict's entire relationship with reality. The Green Fairy, he realizes, had been more than just a drink. It had been a way of avoiding the painful truths about himself and his life that sobriety now forced him to confront. Upon his release from prison in 1897, Oscar faced a choice that would define his final years. He could embrace sobriety and attempt to rebuild his life and career, or he could return to the Green Fairy and accept whatever consequences followed. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who truly understood the nature of his addiction. Oscar's return to absinthe after his release was immediate and total. Within days of leaving Reading jail, he was back in his familiar haunts, preparing his evening ritual with the same ceremony that had characterized his pre-prison days. But something fundamental had changed during his years of forced abstinence. The drink that had once enhanced his natural brilliance now seemed to diminish it, providing temporary relief from depression and humiliation. Rather than inspiration and transcendence. The final period of Oscar's life, spent in exile in Paris, represents one of the most poignant chapters in the entire history of absinthe addiction. Here was a man who had once been the toast of London society, now reduced to begging drinks from strangers in shabby Parisian cafes. His wit, though brilliant still occasionally, had become unreliable, sometimes sparkling with its old fire, but more often collapsing into rambling incoherence. Oscar's death in November 1900, officially attributed to cerebral meningitis, was almost certainly hastened by years of absinthe abuse. His final weeks were marked by the same symptoms that had characterized Vincent van Gogh's last days: hallucinations, violent mood swings, and a complete inability to distinguish between memory and reality. He died believing that he was still at the height of his fame, surrounded by admirers rather than the handful of loyal friends who had remained with him through his disgrace. The tragedy of Oscar Wilde's relationship with absinthe extends beyond his personal destruction to encompass what his fate represented for an entire generation of artists and writers. Here was a man whose natural talents were extraordinary, whose contribution to literature was undeniable, whose influence on aesthetic theory would last for generations. But absinthe had transformed those gifts into instruments of self-destruction, turning his greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. The medical community seized upon Oscar's case as further evidence of absinthe's dangers, but they missed the more subtle aspects of his addiction. Unlike Vincent van Gogh, who had used absinthe to access visions that were otherwise impossible, Oscar had used it to enhance abilities he already possessed. The Green Fairy hadn't given him wit and intelligence, it had simply amplified what was already there. But in doing so, it had also amplified his capacity for self-deception and poor judgment. Oscar's story reveals something crucial about the nature of absinthe addiction that pure medical analysis couldn't capture. The drink didn't just affect the brain's chemistry, it altered the user's entire relationship with reality. For someone like Oscar, whose livelihood depended on his ability to navigate social situations and understand human nature, this alteration proved catastrophic. The same substance that made him brilliant in controlled settings made him reckless in situations that required careful judgment. The pattern that emerges from studying Oscar's relationship with absinthe is one that would be repeated countless times throughout the Green Fairy's reign of influence. Initial enhancement of natural abilities leads to increasing dependence, which leads to tolerance and the need for higher doses, which leads to impaired judgment and dangerous behavior, which leads to consequences that require even more absinthe to endure, which leads to complete destruction of everything the user once valued. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Oscar's story is how completely he understood this pattern while being powerless to break free from it. His letters and diary entries from his final years reveal a man who could analyze his own addiction with devastating clarity while being unable to take any meaningful action to address it. The Green Fairy had not only captured his body and mind, but had convinced him that life without her influence would be unbearably mundane. This philosophical dimension of absinthe addiction, the way it convinced users that ordinary consciousness was insufficient for true artistic achievement, may have been its most insidious aspect. Unlike simple physical addiction, which could theoretically be overcome through willpower and medical intervention, this psychological dependence involved the user's entire identity as an artist and human being. To give up absinthe meant giving up not just a drug, but a way of seeing and being that had become central to creative identity. The artistic community's response to Oscar's death was complicated and contradictory. Many recognized that absinthe had played a crucial role in his destruction, but they also couldn't ignore the extraordinary work he had produced under its influence. His plays continued to be performed, his wit continued to be quoted, his aesthetic theories continued to influence new generations of artists. Had the Green Fairy destroyed a great talent, or had it been responsible for creating that talent in the first place? These questions became even more pressing as reports of similar tragedies began to emerge from across Europe. In Prague, the composer Antonín Dvořák was found dead in his studio, surrounded by empty absinthe bottles and pages of music that seemed to have been written in a state of complete madness. In Barcelona, the architect Antoni Gaudí was hospitalized after an absinthe-induced psychotic episode that left him unable to work for months. In Vienna, the painter Gustav Klimt's famous golden period coincided exactly with his heaviest absinthe consumption, but ended abruptly when he suffered a series of seizures that doctors attributed to thione poisoning. Each of these cases followed the same basic pattern that had characterized the experiences of Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, and Wilde. Initial enhancement of creative abilities led to dependence, which led to escalating consumption, which led to physical and mental deterioration, which led to either death or the complete abandonment of artistic work. The Green Fairy was revealing herself to be not just a muse, but a predator that specifically targeted the most gifted and sensitive individuals in society. The medical establishment's understanding of absinthe's effects was evolving rapidly as more cases came to light. Dr. Magnan's original research had focused on the physical damage that thione caused to brain tissue, but new studies were revealing psychological effects that seemed even more devastating. Researchers in Berlin documented cases of absinthe users who had lost the ability to experience pleasure from any source other than the drink itself, a condition they termed anhédonique absinthique. This psychological anhedonia explained why so many artists found it impossible to give up absinthe, even when they recognized its destructive effects. The drink hadn't just become a source of inspiration, it had become the only source of any positive emotion whatsoever. Without absinthe, these individuals didn't just lose their creative edge, they lost their ability to feel joy, satisfaction, or contentment from any aspect of life. Dr. Auguste Mottet's research at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris revealed even more disturbing findings. Studying the brains of deceased absinthe users, he discovered that prolonged thione exposure didn't just damage existing neural pathways, it created entirely new ones that seemed designed specifically to crave more of addiction, the substance. These pathways were so deeply embedded in the brain structure that they appeared to be permanent, explaining why even years of sobriety couldn't fully eliminate the desire for absinthe. The implications of Dr. Mottet's research were staggering. If absinthe created permanent changes in brain structure, then addiction to the substance might be truly incurable. This meant that every artist who had embraced the Green Fairy was essentially condemned to a lifetime of either active addiction or the constant struggle against overwhelming cravings that would never completely disappear. These medical discoveries were taking place against the backdrop of a growing temperance movement that was seizing upon absinthe as the perfect symbol of everything wrong with modern urban life. Temperance advocates argued that absinthe represented the ultimate corruption of natural human creativity, an artificial substitute for genuine inspiration that ultimately destroyed everything it touched. The drink became a convenient scapegoat for broader anxieties about industrialization, urbanization, and the changing nature of artistic expression. The temperance movement's campaign against absinthe was brilliantly orchestrated and devastatingly effective. Rather than focusing on dry medical statistics or moral arguments, they used the tragic stories of famous artists to illustrate their points. Vincent van Gogh's self-mutilation, Oscar Wilde's imprisonment and exile, Toulouse-Lautrec's early death. These became cautionary tales that resonated with the general public in ways that abstract arguments about public health never could. But the most powerful weapon in the temperance arsenal was the concept of absinthe madness, a supposedly distinct form of mental illness that could only be triggered by consumption of the green fairy. This condition was characterized by violent hallucinations, uncontrollable rage, and a complete break with reality that could transform even the gentlest person into a dangerous lunatic. Whether or not absinthe madness actually existed as a distinct medical condition, the idea of it terrified the public and provided justification for increasingly draconian measures against the drink. The case that ultimately sealed absinthe's fate occurred in Switzerland in 1905, involving a man named Jean Lanfray, who had consumed absinthe before murdering his pregnant wife and 2 children. The incident, which became known as the Absinthe Murders, provided temperance advocates with exactly the kind of shocking example they needed to turn public opinion decisively against the green fairy. The fact that Lanfray had also consumed significant quantities of wine and beer before the murders was conveniently overlooked in the rush to blame absinthe for his crimes. The trial of Jean Lanfray became an international sensation, with newspapers across Europe providing daily coverage of the proceedings. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of medical experts who described absinthe as a liquid madness that could transform ordinary people into homicidal maniacs. The defense's arguments about Lanfray's history of mental illness and domestic violence were overwhelmed by the emotional impact of testimony about the green fairy's supposed powers of corruption. When Lanfray was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, the verdict was seen as a condemnation not just of one man's crimes, but of absinthe itself. Within months, Switzerland had banned the production and sale of absinthe entirely, becoming the first country to take such drastic action. Other nations quickly followed suit, with Belgium, Brazil, and the United States all implementing their own prohibitions before the end of 1905. The artistic community's response to these bans was swift and passionate. Petitions signed by hundreds of prominent artists, writers, and musicians flooded government offices across Europe, arguing that absinthe prohibition represented an attack on creative freedom itself. These petitions painted the green fairy not as a dangerous drug, but as an essential tool of artistic expression that had been unfairly scapegoated by conservative forces that feared genuine creativity. The petition campaigns revealed deep divisions within artistic communities about absinthe's true nature and value. Older, more established artists tended to support prohibition, having witnessed firsthand the destructive effects of the drink on their younger colleagues. But emerging artists, particularly those associated with the new avant-garde movements, saw absinthe bans as attempts to suppress artistic innovation and maintain traditional cultural hierarchies. Pablo Picasso, then still a young and struggling artist in Paris, became one of the most vocal opponents of absinthe prohibition. His famous painting, The Absinthe Drinker, was created as a direct response to the Swiss ban, depicting a melancholy figure contemplating a glass of the forbidden drink. The painting's blue-green colour palette and distorted perspective perfectly captured the sense of loss and disorientation that many artists felt as their beloved green fairy was systematically outlawed across Europe. But Picasso's defense of absinthe was complicated by his own complicated relationship with the drink. His blue period which produced some of his most celebrated early works, coincided exactly with his heaviest absinthe consumption. The paintings from this era are suffused with a melancholy and introspection that perfectly mirrors the psychological effects of regular absinthe use. The distorted figures and elongated forms that characterize these works may have been as much a product of altered perception as artistic innovation. As country after country banned absinthe, a thriving black market emerged to serve the artistic communities that refused to give up their beloved green fairy. Underground distilleries began producing bootleg versions substitute of the drink, often using dangerous suits for the expensive botanicals that gave authentic absinthe its distinctive properties. These illegal versions were frequently more dangerous than the original, containing higher concentrations of thujone and toxic additives that had never been present in legitimate absinthe. The quality of bootleg absinthe varied wildly, creating new dangers for artists who had grown accustomed to the relatively predictable effects of commercial brands. Some batches contained methanol instead of ethanol, causing blindness and death. Others included industrial chemicals that produced violent psychotic episodes. The underground absinthe trade became a deadly gamble where users never knew whether they were consuming their familiar muse or a potentially lethal poison. Despite these dangers, demand for absinthe remained strong throughout the artistic underground. Secret societies devoted to the green fairy emerged in major cities across Europe, complete with elaborate initiation rituals and coded communications systems. These groups preserved not just access to absinthe, but the entire culture that had grown up around its consumption, the ceremonial preparation, the philosophical discussions, the shared sense of participating in something that transcended ordinary human experience. The persistence of absinthe culture in the face of legal prohibition reveals something important about the drink's hold on artistic consciousness. This wasn't just physical addiction or even psychological dependence. It was a complete worldview that positioned absinthe as essential to authentic creative expression. For true believers in the green fairy, giving up the drink meant giving up their identity as serious artists and accepting the mundane existence of ordinary people. The underground societies that emerges and the culture developed to preserve abed their own mythology around the drink, transforming it from a beverage into something approaching a religious sacrament. These groups, known collectively as the Order of the Green Fairy, created elaborate hierarchies based on tolerance levels and artistic achievement under absinthe's influence. New members were required to undergo initiation ceremonies that involved consuming increasingly potent doses of bootleg absinthe while creating works of art that would be judged by the group's elders. The most notorious of these societies was the Circle of Emerald Dreams, founded in Paris by a mysterious figure known only as the Verdant Master. This group attracted some of the most talented young artists in Europe, promising them access to pure absinthe and the secrets of channeling the green fairy's power for maximum creative benefit. Members included future luminaries of the Surrealist movement, who would later claim that their revolutionary artistic techniques had been revealed to them during absinthe-induced visions. André Breton, who would eventually become the leader of Surrealism, first encountered absinthe at a Circle of Emerald Dreams, gathering in 1908. The 19-year-old poet had been struggling to find his artistic voice when a friend invited him to what was described as a gathering of true believers. The ceremony took place in an abandoned warehouse in Belleville, where dozens of artists sat in a circle around an ornate altar dedicated to the green fairy. The ritual began at midnight with the lighting of green candles that had been infused with wormwood oil. Each participant was given a glass of bootleg absinthe that glowed with an unnatural luminescence, the result of phosphorescent compounds that underground distillers had begun adding to distinguish their products from competitors. As the group consumed their drinks in unison, the Verdant Master began to speak about the true nature of artistic inspiration and the role of altered consciousness in accessing higher truths. What happened next would haunt André for the rest of his life. As the absinthe took effect, the boundaries between individual consciousness began to dissolve. Participants reported experiencing shared hallucinations, collective visions that seemed to emerge from some deeper layer of reality than ordinary perception could access. André found himself painting alongside artists he had never met before, creating works that seemed to flow from a collective unconscious rather than individual inspiration. The painting André created that night, which would later describe as his first true work of art, depicted a landscape that existed nowhere on Earth but felt more real than any place he had ever visited. The image showed twisted trees growing from pools of green liquid, their branches reaching toward a sky filled with floating eyes that wept tears of emerald light. The technique was unlike anything he had learned in art school, involving layers of paint applied in patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed from different angles. When André awakened the next morning, he found himself lying on the warehouse floor, surrounded by dozens of similar paintings, all created by different artists, but sharing the same impossible landscape. The experience convinced him that absinthe didn't just enhance individual creativity, it provided access to a realm of shared imagination that existed beyond the boundaries of personal consciousness. This revelation would later form the theoretical foundation for surrealist automatic drawing and collaborative artistic techniques. But André's relationship with absinthe was complicated by his growing awareness of its destructive potential. Even as the drink opened new realms of creative possibility, he witnessed its devastating effects on fellow circle members. Within 2 years of joining the group, he had seen talented artists reduced to babbling madness, promising careers destroyed by addiction, and at least 3 deaths that could be directly attributed to bootleg absinthe poisoning. The most tragic case involved a young painter named Céleste Moreau, whose talent had been recognized by established masters before she discovered absinthe at age 22. Céleste's first encounter with the Green Fairy occurred during a clandestine gathering in Montparnasse, where underground artists had created an elaborate recreation of the café culture that Prohibition had destroyed. The setting was perfect. Dim lighting, ornate glasses, the careful ritual of preparation that made each drink feel like a sacred ceremony. Céleste's initial experience with absinthe was transformative in ways that seemed purely positive. Her paintings, which had previously been competent but unremarkable, suddenly blazed with supernatural energy and vision. She could work for 18 hours straight without fatigue, sustained only by the Green Fairy's embrace, creating canvases that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Gallery owners who had previously ignored her work began competing for the right to display her absinthe-inspired creations. The artistic breakthrough came with a terrible price that became apparent only gradually. As Céleste's tolerance for absinthe increased, she required larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same creative effects. The bootleg absinthe available through underground channels was inconsistent in quality and often dangerously potent, but Céleste consumed it without regard for the risks. Her entire existence became organized around the rhythm of absinthe consumption and artistic creation, with everything else in her life relegated to secondary importance. The physical deterioration was swift and alarming. Within 18 months of her first taste of absinthe, Céleste had lost significant weight, developed a persistent tremor in experiencing hallucinations that purse her hands, and beganisted even when she was sober. Friends reported seeing her engaged in animated conversations with invisible companions, painting portraits of people who existed only in her absinthe-altered perception. The line between creative vision and psychotic delusion had become completely blurred. Céleste's final painting, created just days before her death in 1911, revealed the full extent of absinthe's hold on her consciousness. The work, titled The Green Fairy's Embrace, showed a female figure dissolving into streams of emerald light, while shadowy forms reached out from the darkness to claim her. The painting technique was extraordinary, involving layers of green pigment applied with such precision that the image seemed to glow from within. But the subject matter was deeply disturbing. suggesting that Celeste had come to view her own destruction as a form of artistic transcendence. The circumstances of Celeste's death shocked even the hardened members of the underground Absinthe community. She was found in her studio, surrounded by dozens of unfinished paintings, having consumed what investigators estimated to be nearly a full bottle of bootleg absinthe in a single evening. The cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, but those who knew her understood that she had essentially committed suicide through absinthe, choosing destruction over the possibility of life without the Green Fairy's inspiration. The tragedy of Celeste's fate was compounded by the extraordinary quality of the work she had produced during her brief period of absinthe-enhanced creativity. Her paintings were immediately recognized as masterpieces, commanding prices that would have made her wealthy if she had lived to enjoy the success cruel. The irony was that absinthe had given her everything she had ever wanted as an artist, but only at the cost of her life itself. Stories like Celeste's began to circulate throughout the artistic underground, creating a growing awareness that the Green Fairy's gifts came with an ultimately unacceptable price. Even the most devoted absinthe enthusiasts were forced to confront the reality that their beloved muse was also a predator, specifically targeting the most talented and sensitive individuals for destruction. The drink that had promised to unlock human creative potential was systematically eliminating the very people it claimed to inspire. This growing awareness coincided with increasingly effective law enforcement efforts against the underground absinthe trade. Police raids on secret societies became more frequent and more successful, as authorities developed better techniques for identifying and infiltrating these clandestine organizations. The romantic image of artists gathering in hidden locations to commune with the Green Fairy began to give way to the harsher reality of criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The raid that effectively ended the Circle of Emerald Dreams took place on a cold February night in 1912. Acting on information from an informant, police surrounded the warehouse where the group held its weekly ceremonies and arrested more than 40 artists in possession of illegal absinthe. The raid made headlines across Europe, with newspapers describing it as a victory against forces of moral corruption and artistic decadence. Among those arrested was André Breton, whose brief imprisonment provided him with time to reflect on his relationship with absinthe and its role in his artistic development. During his 3 weeks in jail, André experienced the first extended period of sobriety he had known since discovering the Green Fairy 4 years earlier. The withdrawal was physically and emotionally brutal, but it also provided a clarity of thought that he had forgotten was possible. In letters written during his imprisonment, André described the experience of rediscovering his natural consciousness after years of chemical alteration. Colors seemed duller but more stable. Emotions felt less intense but more genuine. And creative ideas emerged more slowly but with greater coherence. Most importantly, he realized that his artistic abilities had not disappeared during sobriety. They had simply been masked by his dependence on absinthe-enhanced perception. This revelation led André to a painful but necessary decision. Upon his release from prison, he made a complete break with the absinthe underground, abandoning not just the drink, but the entire culture that had grown up around its consumption. The decision was extraordinarily difficult, requiring him to give up friendships, artistic connections, and what had felt like his primary source of creative inspiration. But André had come to understand that true artistic freedom required liberation from chemical dependence. The transition away from absinthe was not smooth or immediate. André struggled with depression, creative blocks, and a persistent sense that his sober work lacked the supernatural energy of his absinthe-inspired creations. There were multiple relapses, secret returns to bootleg absinthe that provided temporary relief, but ultimately reinforced his conviction that complete abstinence was necessary for genuine artistic development. Gradually, André began to develop artistic techniques that could achieve some of the same effects as absinthe, without requiring chemical alteration of consciousness. These techniques, which would eventually become central to surrealist methodology, involved systematic approaches to accessing unconscious material through meditation, dream analysis, and collaborative creative exercises. The goal was to achieve the same expansion of creative possibility that Absinthe had provided, but through natural means that enhanced rather than destroyed the artist's long-term potential. The automatic drawing techniques that André pioneered during this period were directly inspired by his memories of absinthe-induced creativity. By allowing his hand to move across paper without conscious direction, following impulses that seemed to emerge from deeper layers of consciousness, he could approximate the same sense of creative channeling that had characterized his green fairy experiences. The results were often surprising and powerful, revealing artistic possibilities that his rational mind would never have considered. But perhaps more importantly, André discovered that sobriety brought its own forms of creative enhancement that Absinthe had actually prevented him from experiencing. Without the artificial intensity of chemical alteration, he could appreciate subtle nuances of color, form, and meaning that had been lost in the overwhelming sensory assault of absinthe intoxication. His work became more precise, more controlled, and ultimately more emotionally resonant than anything he had created under the Green Fairy's influence. The artistic movement that emerged from André's post-absinthe period would eventually eclipse everything that had been created during the height of the Green Fairy's influence. Surrealism, with its systematic exploration of unconscious material and collaborative creative techniques, proved that the expansion of artistic possibility did not require chemical dependence. The movement attracted many former absinthe users who had made similar decisions to pursue sobriety and natural methods of creative enhancement. Meanwhile, the legal campaign against absinthe was achieving complete success across Europe. By 1914, virtually every major nation had implemented comprehensive bans on the production, sale, and importation of the drink. The underground trade persisted in some areas, but increasingly effective law enforcement and declining demand had reduced it to a shadow of its former influence. The Green Fairy era was effectively over, leaving behind a complex legacy of extraordinary artistic achievement and human destruction. The medical community declared victory over what they had characterized as a public health crisis of unprecedented proportions. Statistics seemed to support their claims. Rates of what had been termed absinthe madness dropped dramatically following prohibition. Violent crimes associated with hallucinations decreased significantly, and overall, alcohol-related hospitalizations declined as people switched to less potent beverages. The campaign against absinthe was held up as a model for how scientific evidence and public advocacy could successfully address social problems. But the artistic community remained divided about the true impact of absinthe prohibition. While few disputed that the drink had caused tremendous individual suffering, many argued that its elimination had also removed an important tool for creative exploration. The period of greatest absinthe consumption, from 1860 to 1910, had coincided with revolutionary developments in virtually every artistic medium. The question of whether this was correlation or causation would continue to be debated for generations. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 effectively ended these debates by transforming European society in ways that made the absinthe era seem like a distant memory. The mechanized slaughter of millions of young men, many of whom had been part of the artistic communities that had embraced the Green Fairy, created new forms of trauma and disillusionment that required different artistic responses. The romantic image of artists gathering in cafes to commune with mystical substances was replaced by the harsh reality of shell shock, poison gas, and industrial warfare. Yet even as the war raged, some artists continued to seek out the last remaining supplies of authentic absinthe, viewing it as a connection to a more innocent time when the greatest danger facing creative minds was their own self-destructive impulses rather than the mechanized violence of modern warfare. These final encounters with the Green Fairy often had a desperate elegiac quality, as if participants understood they were witnessing the end of an era that would never return. The story of Guillaume Apollinaire perfectly captures this transition from the Absinthe era to the modern age of warfare and technological destruction. Guillaume had been a regular participant in Parisian café culture before the war, consuming absinthe while writing the experimental poetry that would influence generations of future writers. His relationship with the Green Fairy had been more controlled than many of his contemporaries, using it as an occasional tool for creative exploration rather than a daily necessity. When war broke out, Guillaume enlisted in the French artillery, trading his absinthe glass for a gas mask and his poet's notebook for military orders. The transition was jarring and profound, requiring him to adapt his artistic sensibilities to a world where beauty and creativity seemed irrelevant luxuries. During quiet moments between bombardments, Guillaume would write letters describing his longing for the simple pleasures of pre-war Paris, the ritual of absinthe preparation, the animated discussions about art and philosophy, the sense that creative work mattered more than political events. In March 1916, Guillaume suffered a severe head wound from shrapnel that left him partially paralyzed and struggling with memory problems that would plague him for the rest of his short life. During his recovery in a military hospital, he was occasionally able to obtain small amounts of bootleg absinthe through black market connections, using the drink to manage both his physical pain and his psychological trauma from combat exposure. The poetry Guillaume wrote during this period, under the combined influence of head trauma and absinthe, represents entirely the new in literature's something verses seem to exist. Frag in a state of constant mentation and reconstruction, mirroring both the effects of brain injury and the perceptual alterations caused by thujon exposure. Words appeared and disappeared without warning, meanings shifted in the middle of sentences, and the overall effect was of consciousness itself being shattered and reassembled in new configurations. This fragmented aesthetic would prove to be prophetic of the artistic movements that dominate the post-war period. The certainties and continuities that had characterized pre-war culture had been permanently destroyed by the mechanized slaughter of the trenches, and artists needed new techniques to express the experience of living in a world where traditional values and beliefs no longer provided reliable guidance. Guillaume's absinthe-influenced war poetry provided a template for expressing this condition of permanent uncertainty and fragmentation. When Guillaume died in November 1918, just 2 days before the armistice that ended the war, his death seemed to mark the final closing of the Absinthe era. The world that emerged from the Great War had no place for the romantic image of artists gathering to commune with mystical substances, in search of transcendent vision. The new reality required different drugs to manage different forms of trauma, and the Green Fairy's promise of creative enhancement seemed quaint and irrelevant in the face of industrial-scale human destruction. The prohibition of absinthe, which had seemed like a victory for public health and moral reform before the war, was revealed to be largely a relevant face of much levant in threats to human welfare and grated creativity. The same governments that had banned absinthe as too dangerous for civilian consumption were now distributing much more potent drugs to soldiers to help them cope with combat conditions. The medical establishment that had condemned thujon as a dangerous psychoactive substance was now prescribing morphine, cocaine, and other narcotics on an unprecedented scale. This contradiction was not lost on the surviving members of the pre-war artistic community, many of whom began to view absinthe prohibition as part of a broader pattern of social control rather than genuine concern for public health. The Green Fairy had been eliminated, not because it was uniquely dangerous, but because it represented a form of consciousness expansion that authorities found threatening to establish social hierarchies. The war had revealed that governments were perfectly willing to accept massive casualties when it served their political purposes, making their earlier concerns about absinthe-related deaths seem hypocritical and manipulative. The post-war period saw occasional attempts to revive absinthe culture, but these efforts were hampered by the fundamental changes that the war had brought to European society. The café culture that had provided the social context for absinthe consumption had been largely destroyed, with many establishments closed permanently and their regular customers dead on foreign battlefields. The artistic communities that had embraced the Green Fairy had been scattered by military service, economic disruption, and the simple passage of time. More fundamentally, the aesthetic values that had made absinthe appealing to pre-war artists seemed inadequate for addressing the new realities of the 20th century. The drink's promise of enhanced perception and creative inspiration had been based on romantic notions of individual artistic genius that the war had revealed to be naive and self-indulgent. The new art forms that emerged from the post-war period emphasized collective action, political engagement, and social criticism rather than the personal transcendence that absinthe had seemed to offer. The Dadaist movement, which emerged directly from the trauma of the Great War, explicitly rejected the aesthetic values that had characterized the absinthe era, where pre-war artists had sought beauty, transcendence, and enhanced perception. The Dadaists embraced ugliness, meaninglessness, and the systematic destruction of traditional artistic categories. Their performances and installations were designed to shock and disturb rather than inspire, reflecting a world where beauty itself had been revealed as a dangerous illusion. Yet even as they rejected the romantic idealism of the absinthe era, many Dadaist artists continued to experiment with consciousness-altering substances in search of new forms of creative expression. The difference was that these experiments were now undertaken with a much more cynical and analytical attitude, viewing altered states of consciousness as tools for social criticism rather than paths to transcendent vision. The playful reverence that had characterized pre-war absinthe culture was replaced by a harsh pragmatism that treated all drugs as potential weapons in the war against bourgeois respectability. This shift in attitude toward consciousness-altering substances reflected broader changes in how European society understood the relationship between individual experience and social reality. The pre-war belief that personal transcendence could somehow transform society had been thoroughly discredited by the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. The new generation of artists understood that meaningful change required collective political action rather than individual spiritual development, and their drug use reflected this understanding. The final chapter of the absinthe story played out in the economic chaos of the 1920s and 1930s, as Europe struggled to rebuild itself from the devastation of the Great War. The black market trade in absinthe persisted in some areas, but it had been reduced to a marginal activity serving nostalgic older artists and curious young people who had heard romanticized stories about the Green Fairy's legendary powers. The quality of bootleg absinthe continued to decline as experienced distillers died or abandoned the trade, making the drink increasingly dangerous for the few who still sought it out. The most poignant encounters with absinthe during this period often involved aging artists who had been part of the pre-war café culture, attempting to recapture something of their lost youth through communion with the Green Fairy. These experiences were typically disappointing, as the social context that had made absinthe meaningful no longer existed. Drinking alone in shabby apartments or cheap hotels, these survivors of a vanished era found that the Green Fairy could no longer provide the sense of connection and transcendence that had made her so compelling in her heyday. The rise of fascism across Europe in the 1930s effectively ended even these marginal survivals of absinthe culture. The new totalitarian regimes viewed any form of consciousness alteration as potentially subversive, and they had the organizational capacity to eliminate underground drug trades with unprecedented efficiency. The romantic individualism that had characterized the absinthe era was completely incompatible with the collective mobilization that fascist movements demanded, and the few remaining devotees of the Green Fairy found themselves targets of systematic persecution. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, authentic absinthe had essentially disappeared from European culture. The drink that had once inspired some of the greatest art in human history had been reduced to a historical curiosity, remembered primarily through the tragic stories of the artists it had destroyed. The Green Fairy's reign had lasted less than a century, but its impact on artistic development and cultural consciousness would continue to resonate long after the last glass of authentic absinthe had been consumed. The legacy of the absinthe era remained complex and contradictory. On one hand, the period of greatest absinthe consumption had coincided with revolutionary developments in virtually every artistic medium, producing works that continued to influence creative expression decades after Prohibition. On the other hand, the human cost of this creative explosion had been enormous, claiming the lives and sanity of countless talented individuals who might otherwise have made even greater contributions to human culture. The medical understanding of absinthe's effects had evolved considerably since the early days of Prohibition, with researchers recognizing that many of the symptoms attributed to thujone poisoning were actually the result of alcohol abuse, complicated by toxic additives in bootleg preparations. Modern studies suggested that authentic absinthe, consumed in moderation, was probably no more dangerous than other high-proof spirits. But this scientific vindication came too late to matter for the artists who had paid the ultimate price for their devotion to the Green Fairy. The cultural memory of the absinthe era became increasingly romanticized as the harsh realities of the 20th century made the Belle Époque seem like a golden age of artistic freedom and creative possibility. Writers and filmmakers began to portray absinthe consumption as a noble form of artistic dedication rather than dangerous drug abuse, focusing on the creative achievements while minimizing the human costs. This romanticization served contemporary needs for inspiring stories about artistic commitment, but it also perpetuated dangerous myths about the relationship between consciousness alteration and creative achievement. The question of whether the extraordinary artistic output of the absinthe era could have been achieved through natural means remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The historical record clearly documented both the creative achievements and the human destruction that had characterized the Green Fairy's influence, but determining the causal relationships between these phenomena required counterfactual speculation about what might have happened under different circumstances. What seemed clear was that absinthe had served as both catalyst and symbol for a particular historical moment when European culture was undergoing fundamental transformation. The drink had provided a means for artists to explore altered states of consciousness at precisely the time when traditional forms of artistic expression were proving inadequate for addressing the complexities of modern urban life. Whether absinthe had caused this cultural transformation or simply facilitated it remained an open question, but its role as a vehicle for creative experimentation during a crucial period of artistic development was undeniable. The Green Fairy's story thus became a cautionary tale about the seductive power of chemical shortcuts to creative achievement, but also a reminder of the extraordinary artistic possibilities that could emerge when talented individuals were willing to risk everything in pursuit of transcendent vision. The tragedy was not that absinthe had failed to deliver on its promises, but that it had delivered too well, providing access to forms of creative experience that proved impossible to sustain without ultimately destroying those who sought them. As the 20th century progressed and new forms of consciousness-altering substances became available to artistic communities, the lessons of the absinthe era remained relevant. Each generation of creative individuals faced the same fundamental choice between the safety of natural consciousness and the risks of chemical enhancement. The story does both of the Green Fairy serve warning and inspiration, reminding future artists that the path to transcendent vision was always dangerous, but that the alternative might be a life of comfortable mediocrity that served neither art nor the human spirit. The final irony of the absinthe story was that Prohibition had ultimately enhanced, rather than diminish the Green Fairy's cultural influence. By making the drink forbidden and dangerous, authorities had transformed it from a simple beverage into a powerful symbol of artistic rebellion and creative freedom. The mythology that grew up around absinthe during the Prohibition era proved more durable and influential than the actual effects of consuming the drink, ensuring that the Green Fairy's legacy would continue to inspire and haunt artistic communities long after the last authentic bottle had been consumed. The story of absinthe's prohibition seemed to mark the end of an era, but the Green Fairy's influence on human consciousness proved more resilient than lawmakers had anticipated. Even as governments across Europe celebrated their victory over what they termed the Emerald Menace, underground networks of artists, writers, and philosophers continued to seek out the forbidden elixir, driven by something deeper than mere addiction or nostalgia. What authorities failed to understand was that absinthe had become more than just a drink during its golden age. It had evolved into a symbol of artistic authenticity, a badge of creative commitment that separated true artists from mere practitioners. The very act of seeking out forbidden a form of artistic absinthe became statement, a declaration that one was willing to risk everything in pursuit of transcendent vision. This symbolic power was most evident in the emergence of what historians would later call the Green Underground, a loose network of artists who maintained absinthe culture through secret rituals and clandestine gatherings. Unlike the open cafe culture that had characterized the drink's heyday, these new practitioners operated in shadows, meeting in abandoned buildings, private homes, and hidden chambers beneath established businesses. The secrecy added layers of meaning to the absinthe experience, transforming each encounter with the Green Fairy into an act of rebellion against societal constraints. The most influential of these underground groups was the Society of Emerald Seekers, founded in Prague in 1913 by a mysterious figure known only as the Wormwood Prophet. This organization attracted artists from across Central Europe who had been driven underground by increasingly strict prohibition enforcement. Unlike earlier absinthe societies that had focused primarily on consumption and creative enhancement, the Emerald Seekers developed elaborate philosophical frameworks around the drink, treating it as a sacrament in a new form of artistic religion. The prophet, whose real identity was never discovered by authorities, claimed to have access to original absinthe formulations from before the era of mass production and adulteration. According to members who survived the organization's eventual dissolution, these authentic preparations produced effects that were markedly different from the bootleg varieties that had flooded black markets following Prohibition. The genuine absinthe was said to provide clarity rather than chaos, inspiration rather than hallucination, creative focus rather than destructive obsession. Whether these claims were accurate or simply the result of wishful thinking among desperate artists remains unclear. What is documented is that the Society of Emerald Seekers attracted some of the most innovative young artists of the pre-war period, including several who would later become central figures in the development of abstract expressionism and experimental literature. Their influence extended far beyond their relatively small membership, as ideas and techniques developed during secret absinthe ceremonies spread throughout European artistic communities. Franz Kafka first encountered the Society of Emerald Seekers in the winter of 1914, during one of his frequent visits to Prague's literary underground. The young writer had been struggling with what he described as the impossibility of writing, feeling trapped between his day job at an insurance company and his burning desire to create literature that could capture the alienation and anxiety of modern urban existence. A friend who belonged to the society suggested that communion with the Green Fairy might provide the breakthrough Franz desperately needed. The initiation ceremony took place in the basement of a defunct brewery, where the Wormwood Prophet had created an elaborate shrine dedicated to absinthe's legendary, was filled with green powers. The room candles, mirrors that reflected and multiplied the flickering light, and bottles containing various preparations of the forbidden drink. The atmosphere was simultaneously sacred and transgressive, combining religious reverence with the thrill of illegal activity. Franz's first taste of authentic absinthe produced effects that he would later describe as the sudden ability to see the machinery behind reality. The familiar world of Prague, with its ancient buildings, V's, and narrow streets, remained nearly unchanged, but Franz could suddenly perceive the hidden systems of power and control that shaped everyday experience. The bureaucratic processes that dominated his professional life revealed themselves as manifestations of larger forces that reduced human beings to mere components in vast, incomprehensible machines. This revelation provided Franz with the conceptual framework he needed to begin writing the stories that would establish his reputation as one of literature's most penetrating analysts of modern alienation. The metamorphosis, begun just days after his first absinthe experience, emerged directly from his green fairy-enhanced perception of how economic and social systems could transform human beings into something unrecognizable. The story's matter-of-fact treatment of impossible transformation perfectly captured the way absinthe revealed ordinary reality to be far stranger and more threatening than surface appearances suggested. But Franz's relationship with absinthe was complicated by his naturally anxious temperament and his growing awareness of the drink's destructive potential. Unlike artists who embrace the green fairy's chaotic aspects, Franz sought to harness its revelatory power while maintaining rational control over his creative process. He developed elaborate rituals around absinthe consumption, using specific doses at predetermined times to enhance his writing without surrendering completely to the substance's influence. This disciplined approach allowed Franz to avoid the worst excesses that had destroyed so many of his artistic predecessors, but it also limited his access to absinthe's most transformative effects. His writing during this period was brilliant and innovative, but it lacked the supernatural intensity that had characterized works created under the Green Fairy's complete dominion. Franz seemed to understand this writing trade diary in his that he had chosen clarity over transcendence, survival over martyrdom. The outbreak of World War I forced Franz to abandon his absinthe experiments as the Society of Emerald Seekers dissolved under pressure from wartime security. The measure's wormwood profit disappeared entirely, taking with him the secrets of authentic absinthe preparation that had made the Society's ceremonies so powerful. Franz's subsequent attempts to recreate his early absinthe experiences using boot were uniformly disappointing, producing only the crude intoxication and unpleasant side effects associated with adulterated versions of the drink. This loss of access to genuine absinthe coincided with Franz's development of the literary techniques that would make him famous. Forced to achieve altered states of consciousness through natural means, he began experimenting with extreme sleep deprivation, prolonged fasting, and other forms of physical stress that could approximate some of absinthe's consciousness-expanding effects. These experiments were dangerous and debilitating, but they allowed Franz to continue accessing the visionary states that had become essential to his creative process. The stories Franz wrote during this period of forced sobriety revealed both the benefits and limitations of natural versus chemical consciousness alteration. Works like In the Penal Colony and A Hunger Artist possessed a stark clarity and logical precision that his earlier absinthe-influenced writing had sometimes lacked. But they also seem to exist in a more constrained universe, bounded by the limitations of ordinary human perception, rather than expanded by chemical enhancement of sensory and cognitive processes. Franz's final encounter with authentic absinthe occurred in 1922, just 2 years before his death from tuberculosis. A former member of the Society of Emerald Seekers had managed to preserve a single bottle of the Wormwood Prophet's original preparation, saving it for what he considered a worthy recipient. When Franz's declining health made it clear that his time was limited, the bottle was offered as a final gift to an artist who had sacrificed his relationship with the Green Fairy for the sake of literary survival. The experience was profoundly different from Franz's earlier absinthe encounters, coloured by his awareness that this would likely be his last opportunity to commune with the substance that had shaped his artistic development. Instead of the revelatory visions that had characterized his initial experiences, Franz found himself overwhelmed by a sense of profound sadness for all the creative possibilities that Prohibition had destroyed. He spent the evening writing letters to artists who had died from absinthe abuse, trying to articulate what their sacrifice had meant for the development of human consciousness. The final piece Franz wrote under Absinthe's influence was a short story called The Green Door, which remained unpublished until decades after his death. The story described a man who discovers a door in his apartment that leads to a realm where all the artists destroyed by the Green Fairy continue to create works of impossible SP. The protagonist ends increasing beauty. Amounts of time in this alternate dimension, gradually losing his connection to ordinary reality until he becomes permanently trapped in a world of pure aesthetic experience. The story served as Franz's meditation on the ultimate meaning of the Absinthe era and its tragic conclusion. He seemed to suggest that the artists who had died from Green Fairy abuse had not simply been destroyed by chemical addiction, but had been consumed by their own commitment to transcendent vision. Their deaths were not meaningless tragedies, but sacrifices made in service of expanding human consciousness beyond natural limitations. This interpretation of the Absinthe era's casualties as martyrs rather than victims became increasingly common among artists who had survived Prohibition. The romantic mythology that grew up around figures like Van Gogh, Wilde, and Toulouse-Lautrec emphasized their dedication to artistic truth rather than their struggles with substance abuse. This mythologizing served important psychological functions for surviving artists, allowing them to find meaning in their colleagues' destruction while justifying their own continued experiments with consciousness alteration. The Green Fairy's influence on artistic development continued through indirect channels long after authentic absinthe had disappeared from European culture. Artists who had experienced the drink's effects during its heyday became teachers and mentors to younger generations, passing on techniques and perspectives that had emerged from absinthe-enhanced consciousness. These influences were often subtle and unacknowledged, embedded in artistic methods and aesthetic philosophies rather than explicitly connected to chemical enhancement. Salvador Dali's surrealist techniques, for example, bore clear traces of absinthe influence, even though the Spanish artist had never consumed the drink himself. His mentor, André Breton, had developed automatic drawing and other surrealist methods as natural alternatives to absinthe-induced creativity, but the underlying aesthetic remained rooted in the consciousness expansion that the Green Fairy had provided. Dali's paintings captured the same sense of reality's fundamental instability that had characterized the best absinthe-era art, achieving through technical innovation what earlier artists had accessed through chemical alteration. The influence extended beyond individual artistic techniques to encompass broader cultural attitudes toward consciousness, creativity, and the relationship between art and society. The Absinthe era had established the principle that authentic artistic expression might require forms of experience that mainstream society found threatening or incomprehensible. This principle continued to guide artistic communities long after the specific substance that had embodied it had been eliminated. The Beat Generation writers of the 1950s explicitly acknowledged their debt to the absinthe tradition, even though they worked with different substances and operated in entirely different cultural contexts. Writers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac understood themselves to be carrying forward the same essential project that had motivated the Green Fairy's devotees: the systematic exploration of altered consciousness in service of expanding human creative potential. Their experiments with benzodrine, marijuana, and other substances were conscious attempts to achieve the same consciousness expansion that absinthe had provided to earlier generations of artists. William Burroughs, the most systematic drug experimenter among the beat writers, made explicit connections between his work and the absinthe tradition in his novel Naked Lunch. The book's fragmented narrative structure and hallucinatory imagery directly echoed techniques that had emerged from Green Fairy-influenced writing, while its unflinching examination of addiction's destructive potential served as a continuation of themes that had first been explored during the Absinthe era. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Green Fairy era was its demonstration that consciousness alteration and creative innovation were intimately connected, even when the specific substances and techniques involved proved too dangerous for sustained use. The period from 1860 to 1915 had witnessed an unprecedented explosion of artistic innovation precisely because artists had been willing to risk everything in pursuit of expanded consciousness. The tragic casualties of this experimentation had not invalidated the underlying principle, but had rather highlighted the need for safer methods of achieving similar results. This recognition led to the development of numerous natural alternatives to chemical consciousness alteration, ranging from meditation and sensory deprivation to collaborative creative techniques and systematic dream analysis. These methods were generally safer than absinthe consumption, but they also required more discipline and produced less predictable results. The trade-off between safety and efficacy would continue to challenge artistic communities throughout the 20th century and beyond. The scientific understanding of consciousness and creativity continued to evolve throughout the decades following absinthe prohibition, gradually providing theoretical frameworks for understanding what the Green Fairy had actually accomplished in the brains of those who consumed it. Neurological research revealed that Thujone's effects on GABA receptors could indeed enhance certain types of creative thinking by reducing inhibitory neural activity, allowing for more fluid associations between seemingly unrelated concepts. These findings suggested that the artistic achievements of the Absinthe era had been based on genuine neurochemical enhancement rather than mere placebo effects or cultural mythology. The Green Fairy had provided access to brain states that were naturally difficult to achieve, temporarily removing some of the cognitive constraints that normally limited creative expression. The tragedy was that this enhancement came at the cost of long-term neural damage that ultimately destroyed the very capacities it had temporarily enhanced. Modern pharmaceutical research began exploring the possibility of developing synthetic compounds that could provide absinthe-like creative enhancement without the toxic side effects that had made the original drink so dangerous. These efforts were complicated by legal and ethical concerns about consciousness-altering substances, but they represented a continuation of the same fundamental human drive that had motivated the original Green Fairy enthusiasts. The cultural memory of the Absinthe era, meanwhile, became increasingly romanticized, as the harsh realities of 2 world wars and economic depression made the Belle Époque seem like a golden age of artistic freedom and creative possibility. Popular culture began portraying absinthe consumption as a glamorous form of bohemian rebellion rather than a dangerous form of substance abuse, focusing on the aesthetic achievements while minimizing the human costs. This romanticization was evident in the numerous films, novels, and songs that used ab to evsin the imagery, oak artistic authenticity and creative passion. The Green Fairy became a symbol of artistic commitment that transcended the specific historical circumstances of its original use, representing the eternal tension between creative achievement and personal destruction that characterized the artistic life. The mythology surrounding famous absinthe users grew increasingly elaborate and often inaccurate, as popular culture transformed historical into archetypal representations figures of artistic dedication. Vincent van Gogh became the tortured genius whose madness was inseparable from his creative vision. Oscar Wilde became the witty aesthete whose devotion to beauty led to his tragic downfall. And Toulouse-Lautrec became the physically deformed artist who found transcendence through chemical enhancement of his natural talents. These mythologized versions of historical figures served important cultural functions by providing inspiring examples of artistic commitment, but they also perpetuated dangerous misconceptions about the relationship between substance abuse and creative achievement. Young artists who encountered these romanticized stories often concluded that self-destruction was a necessary component of authentic artistic expression, leading to cycles of addiction and premature death that continued the tragic legacy of the original Absinthe era. The tension between historical accuracy and cultural mythology became particularly acute as the centennial anniversaries of the Absinthe era's major events began to occur. Academic historians working with newly available archival materials were able to document the harsh realities of green fairy abuse with unprecedented precision, revealing the extent to which popular culture had sanitized and romanticized what had actually been a public health crisis of enormous proportions. These scholarly investigations revealed that the artistic achievements of the Absinthe era had indeed been extraordinary, but they had come at costs that were even higher than previously understood. The number of artists whose careers had been cut short by absinthe-related illness and death was far greater than popular accounts suggested, and the quality of work produced during periods of heavy consumption was often much more uneven than selective historical memory had preserved. At the same time, researchers were discovering that many of the period's greatest artistic innovations had actually emerged during periods of relative sobriety, when artists were able to synthesize and refine insights that had first occurred during altered states of consciousness. This pattern suggested that absinthe's primary value had been as a catalyst for creative breakthroughs rather than as a direct source of artistic inspiration, raising questions about whether similar results might have been achieved through less destructive means. The complexity of these findings reflected the fundamental ambiguity that had always surrounded the Green Fairy's legacy. Absinthe had undeniably played a role in some of history's greatest artistic achievements, but it had also destroyed countless talented individuals who might have made even greater contributions if they had found safer ways to access expanded consciousness. The challenge for contemporary culture was learning to honor the genuine achievements of the Absinthe era while avoiding the dangerous misconceptions that had grown up around its memory. This challenge became particularly acute as new substances with consciousness-altering properties became available to artistic communities throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Each generation of creative individuals faced versions of the same choices that had confronted the original absinthe enthusiasts, and each had to navigate the tension between the desire for transcendent experience and the need for long-term survival and productivity. The lessons of the Absinthe era remained relevant because they illuminated fundamental aspects of human consciousness and creativity that transcended the specific substances and historical circumstances involved. The Green Fairy had provided a window into the extraordinary creative potential that lay dormant within ordinary human consciousness, while simultaneously demonstrating the dangers of pursuing that potential through chemical shortcuts that bypassed the natural development of creative abilities. The ultimate legacy of the Absinthe era was thus neither purely positive nor purely negative, but rather a complex mixture of inspiration and warning that continued to influence artistic communities more than a century after the last authentic Green Fairy had been consumed. The emerald elixir that had promised to unlock human creative potential had indeed delivered on that promise, but at costs that proved ultimately unsustainable for both individual artists and the broader cultural communities they served. As new methods of consciousness exploration continued to emerge, the Absinthe story served as a reminder that the pursuit of transcendent vision would always involve risks and trade-offs that required careful consideration. The Green Fairy had shown what was possible when human beings were willing to risk everything in pursuit of expanded consciousness, but she had also demonstrated that such risks could only be justified if they ultimately served the broader goal of enhancing human creative potential, rather than simply satisfying individual desires for extraordinary experience. The conversation about absinthe's true legacy would continue as long as human beings remained interested in pushing the boundaries of consciousness and creativity. Each new generation would have to decide for themselves whether the achievements of the Green Fairy era justified its costs, and whether the lessons learned from that extraordinary period could guide future explorations of human outcomes. The more productive, more sustainable, and ultimately potential toward Green Fairy's reign had ended. But her influence on human consciousness would prove as enduring as the greatest artworks she had inspired. In the end, perhaps that was the most fitting tribute to a substance that had promised immortality through art while delivering mortality through excess. The Absinthe era had burned brightly and briefly, leaving behind a complex legacy that would continue to illuminate the eternal human struggle between creation and destruction, transcendence and survival, the possible and the sustainable. The irony of Prohibition was that it arrived just as scientists were beginning to understand what absinthe actually did to the human brain. Dr. Heinrich Weber at the University of Vienna had spent years studying the neurological effects of thujone, and his findings in 1915 revealed something extraordinary. The compound didn't just intoxicate the brain like alcohol, it fundamentally rewired neural pathways in ways that enhanced pattern recognition and creative association. The same mechanism that allowed artists to see impossible connections between colors, sounds, and emotions was also creating permanent changes in brain chemistry that made normal life increasingly unbearable. Weber's research showed that moderate thujone exposure could actually strengthen certain cognitive functions, particularly those involved in artistic perception and creative problem-solving. The tragedy was that by the time his findings were published, authentic absinthe had already been banned across most of Europe, and the only available versions were crude bootleg preparations that contained dangerous levels of the active compounds along with toxic adulterants that masked any potential benefits. The scientific vindication came too late for the thousands of artists who had already paid the ultimate price for their communion with the Green Fairy. But Weber's work provided crucial insights into why absinthe had been so uniquely powerful compared to other alcoholic beverages, and why its effects on creative consciousness had been so profound and lasting. The drink hadn't just lowered inhibitions or provided liquid courage. It had actually enhanced the brain's ability to form novel connections between disparate concepts. This understanding helped explain why artists like Paul Cézanne had been able to develop entirely new approaches to representing visual reality while under absinthe's influence. The geometric abstractions that would later influence the development of Cubism emerged directly from Cézanne's ability to perceive the underlying mathematical structures that organized natural forms. This perception wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was the result of enhanced pattern recognition caused by thujone's effects on specific neural networks. The revelation that absinthe had provided genuine cognitive enhancement rather than mere intoxication added new layers of complexity to debates about its prohibition. Critics argued that banning the substance was equivalent to outlawing a tool that had proven essential for certain types of creative work, comparable to prohibiting artists from using specific pigments or musical instruments. Supporters of prohibition countered that no creative achievement could justify the massive human toll that absinthe had exacted on artistic communities. These debates became even more intense as reports emerged of artists who had managed to achieve similar creative breakthroughs through natural means. The composer, Claude Debussy, who had experimented briefly with absinthe before abandoning it due to unpleasant side effects, developed his revolutionary harmonic innovations through intensive study of Indonesian gamelan music and careful attention to natural sound environments. His compositions achieved the same dissolution of traditional boundaries that characterized absinthe-influenced art, but through disciplined observation rather than chemical enhancement. Debussy's example suggested that absinthe's creative effects could be replicated through dedicated practice and systematic exploration of altered consciousness states. This possibility offered hope that the artistic innovations of the Green Fairy era might continue even after the substance itself had been eliminated. but it also raised troubling questions about whether the thousands of artists who had died from absinthe abuse had sacrificed their lives unnecessarily in pursuit of experiences that could have been achieved through safer methods. The philosopher Henri Bergson, writing in the aftermath of absinthe prohibition, argued that the substance had served a crucial historical function by demonstrating the existence of creative potentials that lay dormant within ordinary human consciousness. According to Bergson, the tragedy of the Absinthe era was not that so many artists had been destroyed, but that society had failed to develop alternative methods for accessing the same creative states that the Green Fairy had revealed. This perspective influenced the development of various artistic movements that emerged in the years following Prohibition. The Surrealists, led by André Breton, explicitly sought to achieve absinthe-like consciousness expansion through systematic exploration of dreams, automatic writing, and collaborative creative exercises. Their techniques were designed to bypass rational thought processes and access deeper layers of consciousness where novel associations could emerge spontaneously. The Surrealist experiments produced remarkable results, generating artworks that captured much of the otherworldly quality that had characterized the best Absinthe-era creations. But they also revealed the limitations of purely natural approaches to consciousness alteration. Without chemical enhancement, the visionary states that Surrealists sought were difficult to achieve and impossible to sustain for extended periods. The movement's greatest successes often occurred during brief moments of inspiration that could not be reliably reproduced. Meanwhile, in remote areas where prohibition enforcement was less effective, small communities of artists continued to seek out the last remaining supplies of authentic absinthe. These final encounters with the Green Fairy took on an almost religious significance, as participants understood they were witnessing the end of an era that would never return. The ceremonies became elaborate rituals designed to honor not just the drink itself, but the entire cultural tradition that had grown up around its consumption. One of the most documented final absinthe gatherings took place in a remote mountain village in Switzerland during the summer of 1920. A group of aging artists who had been part of the pre-war Parisian café scene had pooled their resources to purchase what was believed to be one of the last bottles of genuine Pernod absinthe. Produced before Prohibition had forced the company to reformulate their product without wormwood. The gathering included Émile Bernard, a painter who had been close friends with Vincent van Gogh during the latter's final years, and Paul Sérusier, a founding member of the Nabis movement who had used absinthe to enhance his exploration of colour theory. Also present was Maurice Utrillo, whose paintings of Montmartre had captured the essence of the neighbourhood during its absinthe-soaked heyday, and Suzanne Valadon, one of the few female artists to have been fully accepted into the male-dominated world of Green Fairy devotees. The ceremony began at sunset with the careful preparation of 4 glasses of absinthe, using the traditional ritual that all participants remembered from their youth. The sugar cubes were placed with reverent precision. The water was dripped with ceremonial slowness, and the transformation from clear green liquid to opalescent milky substance was observed in complete silence. Each participant understood that this louche effect, which they had witnessed thousands of times before, was occurring for what might be the final time in human history. As the absinthe took effect, the conversation turned of friends to memories and colleagues who had been claimed by the Green Fairy's destructive embrace. They spoke of Vincent's tragic end in Auvers-sur-Oise, of Oscar's lonely death in a cheap de Toulouse-Lautrec Parisian hotel, of Henri's final collapse in his mother's arms. But they also celebrated the extraordinary works that had emerged from those abbreviated lives, the paintings and poems and plays that continue to move and inspire people decades after their creators had succumbed to absinthe's fatal allure. Émile Bernard, whose voice had grown weak with age but whose memory remained sharp, recounted his final conversation with Vincent just days before the artist's suicide. Vincent had spoken of feeling trapped between two equally unacceptable fates: madness or mediocrity. The absinthe that had unlocked his greatest creative periods had also made normal life unbearable, creating a cycle of dependence that seemed impossible to break. Bernard had watched helplessly as his friend chose death over the possibility of existing without the Green Fairy's enhancement. Paul Serussier shared his own struggles with absinthe addiction, describing the years of creative frustration that had followed his decision to abandon the drink in favor of sobriety. His paintings had become more technically proficient, but less emotionally powerful, as if some essential spark had been extinguished when he gave up chemical enhancement of his perceptions. The choice between artistic transcendence and personal survival had haunted him for decades, and he had never been entirely convinced that he had chosen correctly. Maurice Utrillo spoke of the changing character of Montmartre, as prohibition had gradually eliminated the café culture that had made the neighborhood famous. The artists' quarter had become increasingly commercial and touristy, catering to visitors who wanted in life without sanitized version of bod to experience any of the genuine risks that had characterized the absinthe era. The authentic creative community that had once thrived there had been scattered by war, death, and the simple passage of time. Suzanne Valadon offered a different perspective, arguing that the romanticization of absinthe had obscured the real achievements of the artists who had used it. The substance had indeed provided access to extraordinary states of consciousness, but the works created during those states had required enormous technical skill and artistic discipline to execute successfully. The Green Fairy had been a tool, not a substitute for talent and dedication, and the artists who had benefited most from its effects had been those who combined chemical enhancement with rigorous training in their chosen mediums. As the night progressed and the absinthe's effects intensified, the conversation became more philosophical and abstract. The participants found themselves discussing the nature of consciousness itself, the relationship between perception and reality, and the role of altered states in human cultural development. These were the same kinds of discussions that had characterized café conversations during absinthe's heyday. But now they were colored by the knowledge that such conversations would soon become impossible. The final toast of the evening was proposed by Émile Bernard, who raised his empty glass and spoke of the Green Fairy as a teacher rather than a destroyer. Absinthe had shown an entire generation of artists what was possible when human consciousness was freed from its ordinary constraints, he argued. The tragedy was not that the lesson had been learned at such enormous cost, but that the knowledge gained from that sacrifice might be lost if future generations forgot the price that had been paid for it. When the ceremony ended and the participants prepared to return to their separate lives, each understood that they had been present at a historical moment of profound significance. They had shared what was likely the last authentic absinthe experience in European cultural history, closing a chapter that had begun more than a century earlier in the laboratories of Swiss physicians and reached its climax in the café culture of Belle Époque Paris. The bottle was carefully cleaned and preserved as a historical artifact, eventually finding its way to a private collector who understood its significance. The 4 glasses were similarly preserved, each bearing traces of the final drops of liquid that had connected their users to a vanished world of artistic possibility and danger. These objects became relics of a lost civilization, tangible reminders of a time when art and chemistry had combined to produce both transcendent beauty and tragic destruction. The scientific study of absinthe's effects continued even after the substance itself had virtually disappeared from European culture. Researchers working with carefully preserved samples were able to analyze the complex interactions between thujone and other compounds that had given authentic absinthe its unique properties. Their findings confirmed that the drink had indeed provided genuine cognitive enhancement, But they also revealed why bootleg versions had been so much more dangerous than the original commercial preparations. The key difference lay in the precise balance of botanical compounds that master distillers had developed through decades of experimentation. Authentic absinthe contained not just wormwood extract, but carefully measured amounts of anise, fennel, hyssop, and other herbs that modulated Thujone's effects and reduced its toxicity. When Prohibition forced production underground, this delicate balance was lost, resulting in crude preparations that maximized Thujone content while eliminating the protective compounds that had made the original drink relatively safer. This discovery suggested that absinthe prohibition had actually increased rather than decreased the dangers associated with the substance. By driving production underground, authorities had ensured that the only available versions were far more toxic than the commercial preparations they had banned. The policy had succeeded in eliminating a relatively sophisticated pharmaceutical product while creating a market for dangerous street drugs that bore little resemblance to the original. The implications of this finding extended far beyond historical curiosity. As new psychoactive substances continued to emerge throughout the 20th century, the absinthe precedent provided crucial lessons about the unintended consequences of prohibition policies. The pattern of driving sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations underground, only to see them replaced by more dangerous alternatives, would be repeated countless times in subsequent decades. But perhaps the most important legacy of the absinthe era was its demonstration that human consciousness possessed creative potentials that remained largely untapped under ordinary circumstances. The extraordinary artistic achievements that had emerged during the Green Fairy's reign provided proof that the human brain was capable of far more than most people ever realized. The challenge for future generations would be finding safer ways to access these dormant capabilities without repeating the tragic mistakes that had characterized absinthe's golden age. This challenge inspired numerous research programs aimed at understanding the neurological basis of creativity and developing non-chemical methods for enhancing artistic perception. Scientists began studying the brain states of highly creative individuals, looking for patterns that might be replicated through meditation, sensory manipulation, or other natural techniques. These investigations revealed that many of the consciousness changes associated with absinthe could indeed be achieved through disciplined practice, though the process required far more time and effort than simply consuming a chemical substance. The meditation techniques developed by Tibetan monks, for example, were found to produce brain states remarkably similar to those associated with mild Thujone intoxication. Advanced practitioners could achieve sustained periods of enhanced pattern recognition and creative association without any chemical assistance. But mastering these techniques required decades of intensive practice, making them impractical for artists seeking immediate creative enhancement. Similar patterns emerged from studies of other traditional consciousness-altering practices. Sufi whirling ceremonies, Native American vision quests, and various forms of rhythmic breathing all produced temporary states of expanded awareness that resembled absinthe's effects. But these practices were embedded within complex cultural and spiritual traditions that provided crucial frameworks for integrating extraordinary experiences into ordinary life. The absinthe enthusiasts of the Belle Epoque had lacked such frameworks, approaching consciousness alteration as isolated individuals rather than members of communities with established wisdom about managing non-ordinary states of awareness. This isolation had made them vulnerable to the destructive aspects of their experiences while preventing them from developing sustainable approaches to creative enhancement. Modern research into consciousness and creativity continues to grapple with the questions that emerged from the absinthe era. How can human beings access their full creative potential without destroying themselves in the process? What role should chemical substances play in artistic development? How can societies support creative innovation while protecting vulnerable individuals from self-destructive behaviors? These questions remain as relevant today as they were during the Green Fairy's reign, and the answers continue to evolve as new understanding emerges about the relationship between consciousness, creativity, and human flourishing. The Absinthe story serves as both inspiration and warning, reminding each generation that the pursuit of transcendent vision will always involve risks that must be carefully weighed against potential benefits. The Green Fairy's legacy thus extends far beyond the specific historical period of her influence. She represents the eternal human desire to transcend ordinary limitations and access higher forms of consciousness and creativity. The tragedy of her story lies not in the desire itself, which reflects humanity's noblest aspirations, but in the methods chosen to fulfill that desire and the prices paid for temporary glimpses of transcendent possibility. As new technologies and substances continue to emerge with the potential to alter human consciousness, the lessons learned from Absinthe's rise and fall become increasingly important. Each generation must decide how far it is willing to go in pursuit of expanded awareness, and what safeguards are necessary to prevent the kind of widespread destruction that characterized the original Green Fairy era. The conversation about consciousness, creativity, and chemical enhancement that began in the cafes of 19th century Paris continues in laboratories, universities, and artistic communities around the world. The specific substances and techniques may change, but the fundamental questions remain constant. What are human beings capable of achieving when their ordinary limitations are removed? How can those capabilities be accessed safely and sustainably? And what responsibilities do individuals and societies bear for protecting those who choose to explore the furthest reaches of human consciousness? The Green Fairy may have disappeared from European culture, but her influence on these ongoing debates ensures that her story will continue to be told and retold as long as human beings remain interested in pushing the boundaries of what is possible. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting memorial to a substance that promised everything and delivered both transcendence and tragedy in equal measure. The emerald elixir that had captivated an entire generation of artists lives on not in bottles or glasses, but in the questions she raised about the nature of human consciousness and the price of creative achievement. Those questions continue to challenge and inspire new generations of artists, scientists, and philosophers who seek to understand the mysterious relationship between the mind and its capacity for extraordinary experience. The Green Fairy's reign may have ended, but her influence on human understanding of consciousness and creativity ensures that her legacy will endure as long as people continue to dream of transcending the ordinary limitations of human awareness. In that sense, she achieved a form of immortality that even her most devoted followers could never have imagined, becoming not just a historical curiosity, but an enduring symbol of humanity's eternal quest for expanded consciousness and creative transcendence. The Green Fairy's story didn't end with prohibition and the death of her most famous devotees. Instead, it transformed into something even more powerful and enduring.